My name is Anna Whitfield. I'm in my mid-30s, a project manager by profession, a wife by choice, and, until recently, a woman most people thought they had figured out. I've always been described as calm, agreeable, the one who keeps the peace, the kind of woman people trust with responsibilities, but rarely ask how she's really doing. I don't raise my voice. I don't demand the spotlight. And because of that, I've often been mistaken for someone who won't notice when lines are crossed. This story isn't about anger or revenge. It's about awareness. It's about what happens when respect quietly erodes in plain sight, and how loyalty can be tested without anyone shouting, slamming doors, or creating a scene. The moment that forced me to see everything clearly had a deceptively ordinary name. My husband let his mother insult me at Thanksgiving dinner. No dramatic confrontation followed. No plates were broken. But something fundamental shifted inside me that day. If you're expecting a story where I paint myself as a perfect victim or someone else as a cartoon villain, this won't be that. The truth is more uncomfortable and more honest. I played my part in what unfolded, mostly by staying silent when silence felt easier than truth. I told myself I was being mature, understanding, and flexible. What I didn't realize was that every unchallenged slight was teaching people how to treat me. Over the course of this story, you'll hear about small moments most people would dismiss. A comment was brushed off as just how she is. A husband who chose neutrality when clarity was needed. A room full of people where loyalty was tested in front of everyone, and no one quite realized the weight of what was happening, least of all me, at first. This is not a tale of sudden empowerment or dramatic ultimatums. It's a slow, internal recalibration. I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. I will promise you honesty about my fears, my misjudgments, and the quiet strength that grew not from confrontation, but from clarity. If you've ever sat at a table where laughter continued while something inside you went cold, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was kindness or self-betrayal, then you may recognize yourself somewhere in this journey. Before we begin, let me ask you, gently and without judgment, have you ever realized too late that you were being underestimated by the people closest to you? To them, I was easy. That's the word I would use now. Not kind, not generous, not patient. Easy. Easy to rely on. Easy to overlook. Easy to assume would adapt, adjust, and absorb whatever discomfort floated my way without disturbing the atmosphere. In my husband Daniel's family, I was introduced early on as the organized one. The woman who remembered birthdays, brought the right dishes to gatherings, and sent thank you notes afterward. I became useful quickly, and usefulness has a way of disguising invisibility. People smile at you, praise you even, while never quite seeing you as someone whose emotional boundaries matter. Daniel used to say he admired my calm. He told friends I was low maintenance, as if that were the highest compliment a woman could receive. And I accepted that description, not because it was accurate, but because it kept things smooth. I didn't correct him. I didn't add nuance. I didn't say that calm, for me, was something practiced, something learned through years of deciding that reacting cost more than it gave. His mother, Margaret, saw me through a narrower lens. To her, I was polite, pleasant, a background presence who married her son, and stepped neatly into family rituals without disrupting them. She never asked me direct questions about my work or my opinions, but she commented often on my demeanor. "You're so quiet," she'd say, smiling as if that were an observation, not a categorization. "I never have to worry about you causing drama." At first, I took that as approval. When we gathered as a family, holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners, I gravitated naturally toward the edges of conversations, not because I lacked thoughts, but because no one seemed to be waiting for them. Interruptions happened easily. My sentences were sometimes finished by others, reframed, or gently redirected. No one was cruel about it. That's important. There was no open hostility, just a steady, subtle reinforcement of where I fit. Reliable, useful, quiet. And I told myself I liked it that way. I watched how Margaret's comments landed differently on different people. When she teased Daniel's sister, it was affectionate. When she criticized her brother-in-law, it came with laughter and immediate reassurance. But with me, her remarks floated unanswered, Little observations about my cooking, my posture, my career choices. They weren't sharp enough to demand a response, but they lingered long enough to register. Daniel rarely noticed. Or maybe he noticed and filed it under not worth addressing. He trusted my silence as a sign that I was fine. That was my mistake. Silence, when repeated often enough, becomes its own language. And I had taught everyone around me that mine meant consent. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with responsibility. I was not powerless. I was choosing comfort over clarity, harmony over honesty. I believed that being agreeable was a form of strength. Those enduring small discomforts quietly made me mature, evolved, and emotionally intelligent. What I didn't understand then was that people take cues from what we tolerate. Not because they are malicious, but because humans are remarkably efficient. We conserve effort, we follow patterns, and the pattern I had established was simple. Anna will handle it. So when I moved through those rooms, carrying plates, refilling glasses, smiling at comments that didn't quite sit right, I wasn't invisible in the way people imagine invisibility. I was seen, just not considered. Not as someone whose inner experience required care, not as someone whose dignity needed active protection. That was who I was to them. And if I'm being completely honest, that was also who I was to myself. At that stage of my life, I believed worth was proven through usefulness and restraint. I believed that asking for more consideration was indulgent. I believed that love, especially in families, meant absorbing discomfort quietly, so others didn't have to feel awkward. I didn't yet know that loyalty can be tested not in moments of chaos, but in moments of casual disregard. I didn't know how expensive silence would become, but I was about to learn. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. It was small enough to dismiss, wrapped in the kind of tone that makes you question your own sensitivity. We were at Margaret's house for an early autumn dinner, not a holiday, just one of those informal gatherings that felt obligatory rather than celebratory. The table was full, conversation overlapping, glasses clinking softly as people settled into their familiar roles. I had brought a dish that Daniel requested, a simple one, but carefully prepared. As I placed it on the table, Margaret glanced at it and said lightly, "Oh, interesting choice. I suppose everyone has their own standards." She smiled when she said it. No pause afterward, no follow-up. Just enough space for the comment to land and then disappear into the noise of conversation. No one reacted. Not Daniel, not his sister, not the uncle seated across from me, who continued talking about work as if nothing had been said. I felt a brief tightening in my chest. Not hurt exactly, more like surprise. I searched the room instinctively for some acknowledgement, some sign that the comment had registered as odd or unnecessary. There was none. So I smiled too. I took my seat. I told myself it wasn't worth addressing. Maybe she meant something else. Maybe I was tired. Maybe this was just how families spoke to each other. And I hadn't grown up with that kind of humor. But my body remembered it even as my mind tried to let it go. Throughout the evening, I noticed how Margaret spoke around me rather than to me. She asked Daniel questions about our schedule, our plans, even my work, while I sat right there. "Daniel says you're very busy these days," she remarked at one point, as if I were an idea rather than a person. Again, no one corrected the framing, and again I stayed quiet. That night, driving home, Daniel chatted easily about the evening. He mentioned how nice it was to see everyone, how relaxed it felt. I waited for a moment, any opening where he might mention the comment or ask how I felt. It never came. I considered bringing it up myself. The words formed and dissolved in my mind. It wasn't that bad. You're overthinking it. Don't create tension over something so minor. So instead, I said nothing. But silence doesn't erase impact. It only postpones it. In the days that followed, the comment replayed in my head, not obsessively, but persistently. Not because it was cruel, but because it was unnecessary. It served no purpose except to subtly establish a position, hers above, mine below. And what unsettled me most wasn't what she said. It was how easily the room accepted it. That was the first moment I realized something important. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as normal conversation, counting on your desire to be reasonable to protect it. I started noticing more after that. Tiny adjustments in tone. The way my contributions were acknowledged, or not. how often Daniel unconsciously mirrored his mother's framing when speaking about me to others. None of it is dramatic, all of it cumulative. And yet, outwardly, nothing had changed. I still showed up, still helped, still smiled, still believed that being gracious would eventually be recognized as a strength. I didn't confront Margaret. I didn't correct Daniel. I didn't even fully admit to myself that something had shifted. I just carried the memory quietly, like a paper cut you keep touching to see if it still stings. It did. And the most dangerous part wasn't the cut itself. It was how quickly everyone learned that I would bleed without making a mess. After that first small cut, nothing exploded. There was no clear escalation anyone else could point to. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. It just repeats, calmly, until your nervous system stops flinching and starts adapting. Margaret's comments became a background noise I learned to anticipate. Not constant, not overtly cruel, just frequent enough to establish rhythm. A remark about how I must have plenty of free time because I worked from home. A suggestion that Daniel was so patient with me when I disagreed about something trivial. Little narrative edits that repositioned me as softer, less serious, and less authoritative than I actually was. And each time I told myself the same things. She's from a different generation. She doesn't mean harm. This is just her personality. Rationalization is a powerful anesthetic. It dulls discomfort while quietly training you to endure more of it. What made it easier to stay quiet was the collective response, or lack of one. When disrespect is ignored by the group, it starts to feel impolite to point it out, as if naming it would be the real disruption. I didn't want to be that woman, the sensitive one, the one who makes family gatherings uncomfortable. Daniel's role in this was subtle but pivotal. He never defended the comments outright. He simply didn't interrupt them. When I mentioned something once, casually, carefully, he frowned, puzzled. "I think you're reading too much into it," he said. "That's just how she talks." And there it was. The gentle invalidation sounds reasonable enough to accept. Not cruel, not dismissive, just definitive. His confidence in that explanation made me doubt my own perception. If he didn't see a problem, maybe there wasn't one. Or maybe I was expecting too much. So I adjusted. I spoke less. I smiled sooner. I learned which topics were safe and which invited commentary. I edited myself in real time, all while telling myself this was maturity, not self-erasure. What I didn't realize then was that every time I adapted, the boundary moved. What would have unsettled me months earlier now barely registers. The comments didn't stop. They softened, sharpened, reappeared in different forms, and my silence was quietly interpreted as agreement. The hardest part to admit is this: there was comfort in staying quiet. Confrontation requires energy, clarity, and the willingness to risk being misunderstood. Silence asked nothing of me in the moment. It preserved harmony. It let me leave dinners without scenes, holidays without tension. But it also taught everyone something dangerous, that my discomfort was negotiable. I remember one evening in particular, when Margaret joked about how Daniel obviously made the big decisions in our household. People laughed. I laughed too, half a beat late. And in that laugh, something inside me folded. Not broken, folded. Like a document you creased too many times in the same place. I went home that night exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. Still, I didn't change course. I told myself this was temporary, that eventually respect would come through consistency, through proving myself, through being undeniably good, capable, and unproblematic. I didn't yet understand that respect rarely arrives as a reward for endurance. It arrives when silence ends. But at that stage, I wasn't ready for that truth. I was still convincing myself that staying quiet was wisdom, that absorbing small dismissals was the price of belonging. And so, without anyone needing to ask me to, I normalized the very thing that was slowly undoing me. It wasn't a single moment of realization. It was a pattern that finally became impossible to ignore. Somewhere along the way, I noticed that my presence in the family had become conditional. Not in an explicit way, but in a functional one. I was valued for what I provided, not for who I was. I organized. I remembered. I smoothed things over. I absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to adjust. And no one ever said this out loud, but the role was clear. I was the stabilizer, the one who would not challenge, not disrupt, not require recalibration from anyone else. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Family gatherings followed a familiar script. I arrived early to help. I stayed late to clean. I filled gaps, literal and emotional, without being asked. If someone needed something, eyes often turned to me automatically. Not because I was the best person for the task, but because I was the safest. I wouldn't complain, I wouldn't make it awkward. Margaret's comments continued, but they were no longer the center of my awareness. What stood out instead was how the room responded. Or didn't. When she corrected me publicly, no one intervened. When she spoke over me, no one paused. When Daniel deferred to her opinion over mine, it happened so smoothly that it barely registered as a choice. That was the role I had been assigned, the agreeable constant, the one whose feelings were assumed to be manageable. And the most unsettling part was how easily I had stepped into it. I told myself I was being supportive. Those families needed someone like me, that my flexibility was a strength. But flexibility, when it's one-sided, becomes an expectation. And expectation hardens into entitlement. I began to notice how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. Decisions were announced rather than discussed. Plans were made around me, not with me. When I expressed a preference, it was acknowledged politely, and then overridden without comment. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt something quieter, detached, observant, as if I were watching myself play a role I hadn't auditioned for but somehow memorized perfectly. Daniel still described me as easygoing. He said it with affection, but the words started to sound hollow. Easygoing had become shorthand for someone whose needs were optional, someone whose agreement could be assumed. I realized then that the problem wasn't just Margaret. It was the ecosystem that allowed her behavior to blend seamlessly into normalcy, an environment where my silence was convenient and therefore protected. I don't blame them for that. Systems evolve around what works, and my compliance worked beautifully until it didn't. Because the cost of playing that role wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was accumulating in me. A low-grade fatigue, a quiet resentment I refused to name, a growing sense that I was shrinking myself to maintain a version of peace that excluded me. That's when I understood something crucial. I wasn't being mistreated in dramatic ways. I was being managed, placed gently but firmly into a position that served everyone else's comfort. And once you see the role you've been assigned, you face a choice. You can continue performing it, or you can change the script. At that point, I hadn't decided yet. I was still weighing the cost of disruption against the cost of disappearance, still telling myself that things might shift naturally, without forcing the issue. But the awareness had settled in, quietly, permanently. And that awareness would become the beginning of everything that followed. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment anyone else would later remember as significant. In fact, if you asked the people who were there, they'd probably describe it as a pleasant afternoon. It was Thanksgiving. Margaret's house was full in that particular way holiday homes are, warm, crowded, slightly chaotic. The smell of food layered the air. Conversations overlapped, familiar and rehearsed. I moved through the space the way I always did, anticipating needs before they were spoken, stepping around people without interrupting them. At the table, Margaret sat at the head. Daniel is beside her. I took my usual seat, slightly off-center, close enough to be included, far enough to be overlooked. Dinner began smoothly. Compliments were exchanged, plates were passed. And then, without any change in tone, Margaret looked at me and said, "You know, Anna, some women really struggle to keep their husbands interested once they get comfortable. You're lucky Daniel is so patient." The table went quiet for half a second, not long enough for anyone to react, just long enough for the comment to settle. I felt it immediately, not as embarrassment, not even as anger, but as clarity, a sudden sharp awareness of what was happening and how often it had happened before. This wasn't accidental, it wasn't harmless, and it wasn't about humor. It was about position. I looked around the table instinctively. Daniel was smiling, distracted, reaching for his glass. His sister avoided my eyes. Someone changed the subject. No one challenged it. And in that moment, something in me clicked into place. Not loudly, not dramatically. It felt more like a door closing than one opening. I realized then that loyalty was being tested in front of everyone. and that the test wasn't whether someone would defend me loudly. It was whether anyone would acknowledge that I deserved defense at all. I didn't respond. Not because I was stunned, but because I was suddenly very calm. I felt my body settle, my breath slow. The familiar urge to smooth things over simply wasn't there. For the rest of the meal, I spoke less than usual. I listened more. I watched how easily the moment was absorbed by the group, how quickly it became part of the background. I noticed how comfortable everyone seemed once the discomfort had been reassigned back to me. And that's when I understood something essential. Silence hadn't been protecting the peace. It had been protecting the pattern. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I didn't cry that night. I didn't vent. I didn't confront Daniel or Margaret. I went home, took a shower, and stood under the water longer than necessary, letting the noise of the day rinse away. What remained was resolved, not the kind that demands immediate action, the kind that waits, that recalibrates, that decides, quietly, that things will not continue as they have been. From that day on, my silence would no longer be automatic. It would be chosen, and that made all the difference. After Thanksgiving, nothing changed on the surface. That was the first thing people got wrong. They assumed my quiet was the same quiet it had always been. The accommodating kind, the flexible kind, the kind that absorbed and adapted. No one noticed that my silence had shifted in quality. It was no longer reflexive. It was deliberate. I stopped reacting, but I didn't disengage. At family gatherings, I still showed up on time. I still contributed. I still smiled when appropriate. But I began to listen differently. I paid attention not just to what was said, but to who spoke, who was deferred to, and who filled the silence when something uncomfortable landed. I noticed patterns I had previously edited out of my awareness. Margaret's comments became easier to catalog because I was no longer emotionally entangled in them. I didn't rush to reinterpret or excuse them. I simply noted them, the wording, the timing, the audience, how Daniel responded, or didn't. Daniel, for his part, seemed relieved. My lack of visible reaction reassured him that everything was fine. He continued describing me as understanding, as if that were a stable personality trait rather than a choice I was consciously reevaluating. I let him believe that. There is power in being underestimated when you are no longer trying to correct the misunderstanding. I began asking fewer questions and giving fewer explanations, not in a cold way, just in a contained one. When decisions were discussed, I listened more than I spoke. When plans were made without my input, I noted who initiated them and who benefited. What surprised me was how quickly people filled the space I vacated. My silence created room for others to reveal themselves. Margaret spoke more freely. Daniel deferred more automatically. Assumptions were made more boldly. And with each one, the picture became clearer. This wasn't about me being sensitive or misinterpreting tone. This was a hierarchy I had been quietly placed into. And as long as I remained agreeable, no one had any incentive to question it. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes a mirror. People project into it. They assume consent. They expose their expectations. I didn't correct them. Instead, I started preparing. Not emotionally, but practically. I revisited financial documents. I reviewed shared accounts. I reacquainted myself with details I had previously entrusted Daniel to manage. Not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because clarity requires information. I also began documenting. Not formally, not obsessively, just notes, dates, exact phrasing. Not to weaponize later, but to anchor myself in reality. Gaslighting thrives in vagueness. Specifics are grounding. No one noticed. Margaret continued as she always had. Daniel remained comfortable in the belief that harmony equaled health. Family gatherings retained their familiar rhythm. And I remained, to their eyes, exactly who I'd always been. But internally, the narrative had shifted. I was no longer asking, how do I keep this peaceful? I was asking, what does this actually cost me? And once you start measuring cost instead of comfort, silence stops being a weakness. It becomes positioning. What they never noticed was how much time I suddenly had. Not because my life became emptier, but because I stopped spending energy managing other people's comfort. The mental bandwidth that freed up was substantial, and I used it carefully. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still attended family events. I still exchanged polite messages. I still fulfilled my responsibilities at home and at work, but internally I had shifted into observation mode. Quiet, methodical, patient. I started with information. I reviewed years of shared decisions I had waved through because it was easier. Finances, long-term plans, and informal agreements that existed only because I had trusted they were fair. I wasn't searching for betrayal. I was searching for clarity. At the same time, I paid attention to language. Margaret's phrasing was consistent once I stopped rationalizing it. Comments framed as concern, jokes disguised as wisdom, always delivered in public spaces, always just ambiguous enough to avoid challenge. I wrote them down, not with emotion, just with precision. Dates, exact words, who was present. This wasn't about building a case against her. It was about validating my own experience. When you've spent years doubting your reactions, documentation becomes a form of self-trust. I also noticed Daniel more clearly than I ever had before. Not his intentions, those were mostly benign, but his patterns, his reflexive neutrality, his discomfort with friction, the way he unconsciously benefited from my silence while believing himself to be fair. He wasn't malicious. That made everything more complicated. What people often misunderstand about preparation is that it isn't fueled by anger. Anger rushes. Preparation waits. It asks better questions. I began reading, not about relationships, but about boundaries, power dynamics, and decision-making. I learned how often keeping the peace functions as a way to preserve existing hierarchies. I learned that silence is often interpreted not as dignity, but as availability. And slowly, without anyone noticing, I repositioned myself. I took back some autonomy. I separated responsibilities that had been quietly bundled together. I clarified my own values on paper, not as affirmations, but as non-negotiables, what I would tolerate, what I would not. I stopped over-explaining. That was the first external change, though no one named it as such. When Margaret made a remark, I no longer rushed to soften the air. When Daniel assumed agreement, I didn't correct him, but I didn't confirm it either. Ambiguity unsettles people who are used to compliance. Still, no one confronted me. They mistook my calm for continuity. That misinterpretation gave me space. Space to understand that the real leverage I was building wasn't external, it was internal. Clarity about who I was and what I would no longer trade for acceptance. By the time anyone sensed something was different, it was already too late to return to the version of me they were comfortable with. Because what they never noticed was that I wasn't preparing to confront them. I was preparing to choose myself, without spectacle, without warning, and without asking permission. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no surge of triumph, no sense of victory. What I felt instead was a quiet settling, like finally understanding the shape of a room I'd been walking through in the dark. It began with a practical question, one that surfaced while I was reviewing documents late one evening, my planner open beside me, its pages filled with neat, unemotional notes. I asked myself what would actually happen if I stopped absorbing the imbalance. Not hypothetically, but in real, measurable terms. The answer surprised me. I realized how much of our shared stability rested on assumptions no one had examined, because I had never challenged them. Financial arrangements structured for convenience, not equity. Emotional labor is distributed by habit, not agreement. Social harmony was maintained because I carried its weight quietly. And then there was something else, something smaller but more revealing. I saw how Margaret's influence functioned less through authority and more through access. She held her position because everyone else stepped back to make room for her, especially me. Once I stopped yielding instinctively, her power diminished. Not immediately, but noticeably. That was the leverage. Not a secret, not a scandal, just an imbalance that had been allowed to persist because it was comfortable for everyone except me. I didn't feel satisfaction when I understood it. I felt calm. Calm is underrated. Calm allows you to act without needing validation. I didn't share this realization with anyone, not Daniel, not a friend. I let it sit with me, unspoken, until it lost its emotional charge and became simply information. And information, when held quietly, changes how you move. I stopped imagining conversations where I defended myself. I stopped rehearsing explanations. I didn't need them anymore. The need to be understood had been replaced by the need to be aligned with myself. That was the true reveal. I didn't need anyone's permission to redefine my role. I didn't need agreement to withdraw from dynamics that cost me dignity. I also realized something harder to accept, that if I moved forward, there would be no clean resolution. No apology made it all better. No moment where everyone suddenly saw what they had missed. There would only be consequences, and I was ready for that. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I was no longer willing to punish myself for their comfort. I closed my planner that night with a sense of finality. Not an ending, more like a line drawn quietly, firmly, in ink. From that point on, my decisions would no longer be guided by how things looked. They would be guided by what was true. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes uncomfortable. That was the stage I entered after the private reveal. Not panic, not urgency, but a steady pressure to act in alignment with what I now understood. Awareness, when left unused, turns into self-betrayal. I knew that. I could feel it. I laid out my options the way I do with complex projects at work. Calmly. On paper. No dramatics. Option 1 was the familiar one. Say nothing, continue managing the imbalance, accept that this was the cost of belonging. It was the least disruptive path. It preserved appearances. It required no difficult conversations. But I understood now what that option actually meant. It meant consenting, actively, to a role that diminished me. Option 2 was confrontation. Direct, explicit, emotional honesty laid out at the table. It was tempting in theory. It promised relief. But I knew myself well enough to know the likely outcome. Defensiveness, minimization, a flurry of explanations that would turn the focus onto tone instead of truth. And even if something changed temporarily, the underlying dynamic would remain. Confrontation would create a moment, it would not create a structure. Option 3 was quieter and irreversible. I could change my participation, not by issuing ultimatums, but by withdrawing from the systems that relied on my silence, by making decisions that didn't require permission, by no longer cushioning the impact of other people's choices. This option didn't ask anyone to agree with me. It didn't even ask them to understand. It simply required me to act as if my boundaries were real. I chose the third. That choice wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a rush of empowerment or a speech rehearsed in my head. It felt more like closing a door behind me, not angrily, but firmly, because I had already stepped into another room. I knew then that once I acted, there would be no return to the version of me they were comfortable with. The dynamic depended on my compliance. Remove that, and everything would recalibrate, messily, unevenly, but truthfully. There would be confusion, possibly resentment, certainly discomfort. And I accepted that. The moment I made this decision, something else became clear. I wasn't responsible for how others handled the consequences of a balance they had benefited from. That responsibility had never been mine. I slept well that night, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped negotiating with myself. The next steps would be quiet, unremarkable on the surface, but they would set things in motion that no apology, no backtracking, no sudden awareness could undo. And that was exactly the point. The most effective changes rarely announce themselves. Once I made the decision, I didn't rush. I moved the way I always had, carefully, thoughtfully, but with a different objective. This time I wasn't trying to preserve harmony. I was building autonomy. The first shifts were logistical, quiet, boring even. I separated responsibilities that had been blended together under the assumption of trust. Not because trust was gone, but because clarity was overdue. I reviewed shared financial structures and adjusted my own contributions so they reflected reality, not habit. Nothing drastic, just accurate. Accuracy changes things. I stopped volunteering for roles I had never formally agreed to. When plans were made that assumed my labor, hosting, organizing, smoothing, I didn't object. I simply didn't step in automatically. If someone asked directly, I answered honestly, without explanation or apology. No, I won't be able to handle that this time. The sentence felt foreign at first, not heavy, just unfamiliar. No one challenged it. They laughed it off, assumed it was temporary. Daniel noticed some of this but interpreted it as stress or fatigue. He offered help, which I accepted selectively. I didn't correct his assumptions. I didn't need to. What mattered was not what he thought, but what I was doing. I also changed how I engaged socially. I stopped preemptively managing Margaret's moods. If she made a remark, I didn't react. I didn't soften the space or redirect the conversation. I let the comment stand on its own. Without my intervention, its tone became clearer to others. Not immediately, but gradually. What struck me most was how invisible these changes were to everyone else. No alarms went off. No one pulled me aside to ask what was wrong. The system didn't recognize the shift because it had been designed around my quiet compliance. That gave me time to observe how people responded when the cushion was removed. Time to see who stepped up, who grew uncomfortable, and who grew louder. Patterns reveal themselves quickly when you stop compensating for them. Throughout all of this, I remained calm. That was important. Calm denies people the narrative they expect. There was no anger they could point to, no emotional outburst they could dismiss, just a steady withdrawal of labor they had come to rely on. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply no longer participating in my own diminishment. And because nothing looked dramatic on the surface, no one realized yet that the balance had already shifted. But systems always feel stable, right up until the moment they don't. The first signs weren't confrontations. They were inconveniences. Things stopped flowing as smoothly as they used to, and no one could quite name why. Family gatherings felt slightly disjointed. Plans took longer to finalize. Small tensions surfaced in places that had once been seamless. I noticed it before anyone else did. Without my quiet coordination, tasks fell unevenly. Someone forgot to bring something. A detail slipped through. Margaret's gatherings became sharper around the edges. Not chaotic, just less polished. She seemed more irritable, though she couldn't identify the cause. Daniel mentioned it one evening, almost casually. Things feel a little off lately, don't they? I agreed. I didn't elaborate. People tend to sense loss before they understand its source. And because no one had ever acknowledged my role explicitly, they struggled to articulate what was missing. Margaret, in particular, reacted with confusion masked as criticism. Her comments sharpened, not toward me directly at first, but toward the situation. People just don't put in the effort anymore, she said once, glancing around the table. The irony didn't escape me. Still, I said nothing. What I found most telling was how quickly the room began to feel uncomfortable without my usual buffering. Remarks that would have previously been smoothed over now lingered. Jokes landed awkwardly. Silence stretched longer. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, others began to notice. A look exchanged. A subtle shift in posture. Someone cleared their throat when Margaret spoke. These were not acts of defense, but of awareness. The environment was no longer being managed into harmony. Daniel grew quieter, too. He seemed unsettled, as if a familiar structure had shifted beneath his feet. He asked more questions, though none of them went deep enough to reach the core issue. "Are you okay?" he asked once. "I am," I said, and it was true. The consequences weren't explosive, they were cumulative. A sense of imbalance was spreading outward from the space I had vacated. And because I wasn't framing it, explaining it, or apologizing for it, others were forced to experience it directly. That's when something interesting happened. The dynamic began to reveal itself without my involvement. People don't like unnamed discomfort. They search for causes. And when the obvious scapegoat, the sensitive one, is calm and unchanged, attention turns elsewhere. Not to blame, in observation. I watched all of this quietly, not with satisfaction, but with confirmation. The cost I had been paying wasn't imaginary. It had been structural. And now that the structure was exposed, everyone felt it. Still, no one addressed it directly. Not yet. The shift from confusion to panic was subtle but unmistakable. It began when small adjustments stopped working. When the usual strategies, humor, deflection, casual reassurance, failed to restore the comfort everyone had grown used to. The system tried to correct itself, but it no longer knew where the imbalance had originated. Margaret was the first to show it openly. Her tone changed, not sharper, but less certain. She asked questions she had never asked before, though they were framed as criticism. "Is something wrong?" she said once. Not to me directly, but to the room. No one answered. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Heavier, less cooperative. Daniel grew restless. He tried to initiate conversations that hovered around the issue without touching it. He suggested spending more time together as a family. He asked if I felt disconnected. Each question circled the truth without landing on it. And I realized then that we had passed the point of easy repair. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the dynamic they wanted restored required my silence, and I was no longer available for that role. I wasn't cold, I wasn't distant, I was simply clear. That clarity unsettled them. There is a moment in every shifting system when people sense that the old rules no longer apply, but the new ones haven't been named yet. That liminal space is uncomfortable. People grasp for familiarity. They apologize vaguely. They promise effort without understanding what effort is needed. Margaret offered a half apology one afternoon. "If I ever said anything that upset you, you know I didn't mean it that way." It was delivered gently, carefully, and far too late. Not because it wasn't sincere, but because it wasn't specific. It asked me to resume the role of translator, forgiver, stabilizer, to smooth the moment and reassure her that nothing fundamental had changed. Something had. Daniel tried next, in his own way. He admitted he might have missed a few things. He asked what I wanted. The question landed differently now. It wasn't that I didn't know the answer. It was that answering it would require renegotiating a foundation that had already cracked. "I want to live in alignment with myself," I said. "And I am." That was the most honest response I could give. There was no dramatic fallout, just the quiet realization that the version of me they wanted back no longer existed, that the ease they were trying to restore depended on a silence I would not resume. Regret surfaced in fragments, in glances, in unfinished sentences. But regret, like awareness, has a window. And that window had closed, not out of punishment, out of timing. Because some dynamics don't break when you confront them. They break when you stop holding them together. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no long speeches rehearsed in advance. Just three of us sitting at a table one evening, Daniel, Margaret, and me, with the unspoken understanding that avoidance was no longer possible. Margaret spoke first. She asked, carefully, whether she had done something to offend me. I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't rush to soften the question. I let it sit long enough to be real. "Yes," I said, "over time." The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. She asked for examples. I gave them, not as a list, not as an indictment, but as facts. Exact words, specific moments, no embellishment. There was no satisfaction in doing this, just clarity. Daniel listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was halting. He admitted he hadn't intervened because he hadn't wanted to create conflict. I acknowledged that. I also told him what that choice had cost me, not emotionally, structurally. I explained that my silence had been mistaken for resilience, and that I had paid for that misunderstanding quietly for years. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't ask for change. I told them what I would no longer accept. Margaret apologized then, directly this time. It was sincere, it was human, and it mattered. But it didn't undo the shift, because the confrontation wasn't about repair. It was about recognition. And recognition, once delayed long enough, changes what repair can look like. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. There were no promises, no declarations of renewed closeness. Just an understanding that the dynamic had changed and that it would not revert. I left that table feeling neither victorious nor defeated. Just finished. What surprised me most after everything settled was not relief, but normalcy. Not the performative kind, the kind you post about or announce, the quiet, almost boring normalcy of waking up without a knot in your chest. Of moving through conversations without rehearsing how much of yourself you're about to give away. Of realizing one day that the constant internal calculation has simply stopped. Nothing dramatic replaced it. Just space. I am still the same woman in many ways. I still speak softly. I still listen more than I talk. I still value peace, order, and emotional restraint. But the meaning of those traits has changed completely. Before, my calm existed to keep other people comfortable. Now it exists to keep me intact. That difference may sound subtle, but it reshaped everything. I no longer confuse being agreeable with being good. I no longer interpret discomfort as something I'm automatically responsible for fixing. When silence appears in a room now, I don't rush to fill it. I let it breathe. I let it reveal who feels entitled to comfort and who is willing to sit with truth. This version of me does not disappear in conversations. I notice when my body tightens. I notice when something feels off. And instead of explaining it away, I trust that signal. Not every signal demands a response, but every signal deserves acknowledgement. That alone has changed how I move through the world. With Daniel, the shift has been the most complex and the most real. We are still married, we still share a life, but the dynamic is no longer built on my unspoken adaptation. He notices now when I pause, when I don't immediately agree, when I ask questions instead of smoothing outcomes. At first, that unsettled him. He had grown used to a version of me that made things easy to interpret, easy to assume, easy to rely on without checking in. Now he has to engage differently, more deliberately, sometimes awkwardly, and I let him. I don't rescue him from the discomfort of learning. We talk more slowly now. There are pauses, moments where neither of us rushes to resolve tension. That's new, that's growth. Not romantic, not cinematic, but honest. He has apologized, more than once. Not with grand gestures, but with awareness, with changed behavior that doesn't ask for applause. I don't hold those apologies like trophies. I receive them, evaluate them, and let them stand on their own. Trust, I've learned, is not restored by words, it's restored by pattern. With Margaret, the relationship has settled into something quieter and more distant. There is politeness, there is restraint, there is less familiarity, and that is intentional. I no longer overfunction to preserve closeness that costs me self-respect. I no longer manage her emotions for her. If something she says lands awkwardly, I let it land. Sometimes she corrects herself. Sometimes she doesn't. Either way, it is no longer my work. What has surprised me most is not how others have changed, but how I have. I no longer feel the urge to justify my boundaries. I don't explain why something doesn't work for me unless the explanation serves me. No is no longer a sentence I decorate. I also no longer crave recognition for endurance. That was a quiet addiction I didn't know I had. The hope that someone would eventually notice how much I carried and reward me for it. Letting go of that hope was painful, but it was also freeing. Because when you stop waiting to be seen, you start seeing yourself clearly. I see now how often I minimize my own intelligence, my own authority, my own instincts. Not because they weren't strong, but because expressing them threatened the roles others relied on. I understand now that quiet dominance is not about control over people. It's about control over participation. I choose where I invest. I choose how much I give. I choose when silence is strategic and when speech is necessary. And when I speak now, it lands differently, because it is no longer diluted by apology or doubt. There is no bitterness in this phase of my life. Bitterness requires fixation, and I am no longer fixated on who failed me or how long it took to notice. That chapter has closed, not in anger but in accuracy. I understand now that many people did not intend to hurt me, but intention does not erase impact, and love does not excuse patterns that require self-erasure to maintain. This version of me does not demand loyalty tests. She simply stops participating where loyalty is optional. That has been the most profound shift of all. I no longer ask, how do I keep this peaceful? I ask, does this honor who I am? And if the answer is no, I don't argue with it. I adjust my presence, quietly, permanently. There is a version of this story that could have ended with shouting, with ultimatums, with someone being exposed or embarrassed in front of others. That version would be easier to explain, easier to label as justice. But that was never what this was about. What happened to me did not require a villain to be dramatic. It only required enough people to stay comfortable while one person stayed quiet. And that is far more common than we like to admit. The hardest lesson I learned is also the simplest. People don't protect what they don't have to notice. For years, my silence made everything easier, for everyone except me. And because I handled the discomfort well, it was treated as manageable, not urgent, not worthy of interruption. Until I stopped managing it. There is a quiet kind of power in realizing that you don't need permission to change your participation, that you don't owe explanations for boundaries you should never have had to justify, that dignity is not something granted by others when you behave well enough. It's something you either protect or slowly trade away. I didn't lose my family. I didn't win an argument. I didn't become someone else. I simply stopped paying for belonging with self-erasure. And that choice changed everything. What I want you to take from this is not that silence is wrong. Silence can be wise. Silence can be strategic. Silence can be strength. But unexamined silence becomes a contract you never meant to sign. If you are always the one smoothing things over, If your discomfort is routinely reframed as sensitivity, if loyalty is measured by how much you can tolerate without complaint, then something important is being taught, quietly, to everyone around you. This story isn't a call to confrontation. It's an invitation to awareness, to notice when keeping the peace starts to mean abandoning yourself, to notice when patience turns into permission, to notice when love is conditional on your silence. Because once you see that clearly, you don't need revenge. You don't need speeches. You don't even need validation. You just stop participating in what costs you too much, and the world adjusts, or it doesn't. Either way, you remain whole. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to leave you with one question, not to answer for me, but for yourself. And if you choose, in the comments below, where in your life have you been quiet to keep things comfortable? And what has that silence been costing you?